Okay, so one more thing before I start. I'm fairly new to this extended mind business, so it might be that I'm going to say really dumb stuff in the next hour. If so, please tell me. I'll be happy to take any criticisms on board. All right, so it seems there's a lot of talk about group attitudes. And what I mean by that is ascriptions of group belief, group knowledge, group desires, group wants. So for instance, we say that Google wants to know where you are, the NSA knows all about you, the Catholic Church believes that Mary was conceived immaculately, that sort of thing. Now, some philosophers have argued that all such talk should be understood metaphorically or should be reduced to ascriptions of attitudes to individuals. But it seems to me there's a growing number of philosophers who actually countenance the existence of what I call robustly collective attitudes. So they think that at least some of these ascriptions should be understood realistically as ascribing genuinely collective states to collectives, right? So states that somehow go above and beyond mere summations of individual states. So that's the sort of thing I mean by robustly collective attitudes. And I'm going to use group belief as sort of the running example, but I think, at least I hope, that a lot of what I have to say is going to generalize to other collective states other than belief and knowledge. So let me just briefly give you one prominent account of group belief, so you get a feel for the sort of thing I'm thinking about. Excuse me. So there's this thing called the joint acceptance account of group belief. It's prominent in the work of Margaret Gilbert. Raimo Tuomola, who was talked about yesterday, also defends a version of it. Brad Ray, Kai Mathieson, Christina Rowland, Fred Schmidt, all of them sort of accept something like this account. And it's on your handout, section 1. So here's what the account says. A group G believes that P if and only if the members of G jointly accept that P. Members of a group G jointly accept that P if and only if it is common knowledge in G that the individual members of G have openly expressed a conditional commitment jointly to accept that P together with the other members of G. So it's kind of a mouthful, but what that says is that a group can decide to accept a certain view as the group's view, as the group's belief, by, say, going through some sort of procedure and then deciding that they're going to let this proposition stand as the group's view, as the group's belief. And that's sort of conditional on their being aware that all the other group members have the same attitude. So they also know and they accept that this is going to be the group's view. So there's some debate about whether this suffices as it stands to give an account of group belief. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. So some people think this is really not belief, but group acceptance. So that's okay for now. If you don't think this is group belief, then think of it as group acceptance. That's still going to be a robustly collective attitude in my sense. All right, so to make the point that this is robustly collective, note that what is going on here is really something above and beyond a mere sum of individual acceptances or individual beliefs. There is this sort of group process, this deliberative process, or this going through a procedure and then deciding as a group to let this proposition stand as the group view. And that is required for there to be a group view. So it's not just sort of taking all the individual beliefs together and then saying that there's a group belief. All right. So also note, and that's going to be important for later things in my story, that if a group has a belief on this account, it has always explicitly considered P. Right? Groups cannot just sort of come to have beliefs without even having considered or endorsed P. Also note that groups can act and maybe form intentions, and they can do so on the basis of group beliefs. Right? So if a group has decided that they believe that P, they can then sort of intend to do something based on that particular belief. All right. So this is what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about robustly collective attitudes. Now here's the objection to the existence of robustly collective attitudes I want to be discussing. And again, I'm going to start with a quote, this one from Paul Taggart in a 2010 episteme paper. So he writes, "If mental representations in humans result from neural mechanisms, then we have a strong reason to reject the claim that groups, such as banks and governments, have them, because groups do not have neural processes. Groups have brains only to the metaphorical extent that the individuals in them have brains. Hence, I reject the realist claim that social organizations, such as banks, actually have beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions, robustly collective states, since these require brains." Actually, Taggart is not exactly opposed to ascribing these sorts of states to groups, but he thinks they should be understood metaphorically. So I think he thinks they can be useful metaphors, but definitely not literally true in any way. So the thought is, well, if you sort of think carefully about what a group belief is, you're going to notice pretty quickly that it has sort of, there are crucial differences between group beliefs and individual beliefs, and for that reason, we shouldn't say that there are group beliefs. So that's sort of, we can sort of generalize the thought behind this quote and this objection. And the strategy to get this objection off the ground would be to find salient differences between individual belief and group belief, and then point out that because group belief or other collective attitudes lack this feature that individual beliefs have, they really aren't the same thing. They really aren't robustly collective attitudes. So there's a very small list there on your handout of features that you could point to that are going to be different in individual and group beliefs. So individual attitudes are, at least partly, depending on whether you're a content externalist or internalist, at least partly inside the head or inside the skin, if you prefer. And that's not going to be the case, at least not literally, for group attitudes, because groups don't have heads and skins in any literal way, right? And another, so a second item on the list there, individual attitudes involve internal representations. So to believe something is to form some sort of internal representation of the proposition you're believing. And again, this is true for individual belief, but it's not going to be true for group belief, because groups don't have the kinds of internal representations that individuals do. So here's the objection slightly in a slightly more formalized way. So first premise, groups don't have an internal mental life of their own. Well, unless you're Philip Pettit and you think that groups have minds of their own, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I mean, it's interesting, but I'm just not going to talk about it. So just assume that this is right. I mean, it seems pretty plausible, right, when you sort of think about it at first sight. All right, so second premise, if groups don't have an internal mental life of their own, they cannot have internal representations. Well, because these internal representations sort of take place inside minds. So if there's no mind, there are no representations to be had. From that, it follows that groups cannot have internal representations. Next step would be that robustly collective attitudes, like group beliefs, require these sorts of interpretations. Conclusion is that groups cannot have robustly collective attitudes. And so the further conclusion would be that robustly collective attitudes don't exist. Because if groups don't have them, what else will? Right? So if we establish that groups don't have them, there are not going to be any robustly collective attitudes. Good. So that's the objection. And now I'm going to reply to it. And I'm going to do so, again, by considering the example of belief. And so the first sort of question would be, well, what exactly is a belief? And as I'm sure you're all aware, there are different accounts of what belief are. And I'm going to be talking about two of those and ignore two others. So this is section 3 on your handout. According to some people, to have a belief is to have a certain set of dispositions, to act, to behave in certain ways, to maybe reason in certain ways. So that's dispositionalism. And I mean, some people want to say it's not just dispositions to act and reason in certain ways, but it's all, I mean, there's also backward-looking causal roles involved, so that's sort of generalizing dispositionalism that gets you functionalism. So we're going to treat those as more or less the same here. The second answer, second account of belief that I'm going to be talking about is representationalism. So to have belief is to have some sort of internal representation. Then there's interpretationalism, so the kind of Dennett-Davidson view. I'm not going to talk about that. And then there are people who basically say there are no beliefs, so that's eliminativism. Also not going to talk about that, because as Jerry Fodor used to say, if there are no beliefs, it's the end of the world, so let's not talk about that. Okay, so how about this? Suppose you think of a belief as what it is to have a belief as to have a set of dispositions. So to believe that P, this is section 4 on the handout, to believe that P is to act and be disposed to act in certain ways pertaining to P. So if you believe that there is beer in your fridge, you're going to be disposed to act in certain ways. If you desire beer, you're going to get up, walk to the fridge, and grab a beer. If a friend asks you, is there any beer here? You're going to say, yes, it's in the fridge. So, right, dispositions to act and to reason also in certain ways. So note that if dispositionalism about belief is correct, then premise 4 of the argument that I gave you is false, right? So if for a group to have a belief is for it to have certain dispositions to act, then it seems that internal representations don't even enter the picture. So it seems that groups can act in certain ways, they can be disposed to act in certain ways. So if that's all there is to having a belief, then group beliefs are going to be fine. They don't require this sort of internal mental representation. Or do they? So let's think a little bit more about dispositionalism as a position. And I mean, this might be very familiar terrain for some of you, maybe all of you, who knows. So if you sort of think about what sort of dispositions go into having a belief, it seems there's a dilemma. You're going to run into a dilemma. So you might say, and this is sort of the old school dispositionalism, it's only behavioral dispositions and perhaps what you might call cognitive dispositions, so dispositions to reason in a certain way. You can also sort of try to cash that out in terms of outward behavior, so it's reasoning. So if that's the way you're going to go, then everything looks fine for robustly collective attitudes, right? Because it seems pretty uncontroversial that groups can do that. They can have these sorts of dispositions. But of course, there are well-known objections to this reductionistic, dispositionalist account of belief. So there's Hilary Putnam's famous example of the super Spartans and super Stoics, so super Spartans, creatures that have pain. So they have this sort of internal mental state, but they show no outward behaviors usually typically associated with pain. That seems possible. So people can have pain without showing any behavior. So the same thing for belief, right? People could have beliefs, yet show no sort of behavior typically associated with that belief. And so that also applies to group belief, it seems. So it seems plausible that some groups can have certain beliefs, yet show no outward behavior. And I guess a lot of groups in philosophy seminar rooms are like that. I mean, they form all sorts of beliefs, but there's hardly any sort of outward behavior associated with those beliefs. Good, so that's going to be a problem if you're that sort of dispositionalist. So another objection, more or less along the same lines, comes from Roderick Chisholm, and he points out that whether you're going to show certain behavior, whether having a belief is going to give rise to certain behavior, is going to depend on all sorts of other beliefs that you also have. So whether you're going to assert that there's beer in the fridge is going to depend on other desires, other other things you believe. So if you know, there's a friend that you're in your house and he asks you, oh, is there beer here? And if you think, you know, that friend is going to drink all my beer and it's going to be terrible, he's going to get drunk and stay on my couch forever, you're probably not going to assert that there's beer in the fridge, right? So there's this mutual interdependence. And what that means is that it's going to be hard to analyze belief completely, or actually impossible to analyze belief completely in terms of these outward behaviors. Okay, good. So I think there are pretty serious objections to this form of dispositionalism. So you might think, well, you know, it circumvents the objection to robustly collective attitudes, but the cost is just too high. This is implausible as an account of belief. So for these sorts of reasons, people have proposed more liberal accounts of dispositionalism. And I'm going to point to the example of Eric Schwitzgebel. Never quite sure how to pronounce his name. Schwitzgebel, does that sound right? Okay. So he calls himself a liberal dispositionalist, and for him, he sort of adds another kind of dispositions to the fold. So what he thinks is this: to believe that P is nothing more than to match to an appropriate degree and in appropriate respects the dispositional stereotype for believing that P, where a dispositional stereotype crucially includes behavioral dispositions, so the ones I was talking about before, but also phenomenal dispositions and cognitive dispositions having to do with P. So very quickly, what is a dispositional stereotype? So that's sort of a cluster of dispositions associated with a particular belief. So for the belief that there's beer in your fridge, there's going to be a cluster of behavioral dispositions, cognitive dispositions, and phenomenal dispositions. And so these phenomenal dispositions that he wants to include, they have to do with sort of internal experiences, I guess. So, you know, upon considering P, you find that P has, you know, the glow of truth surrounding it. It seems true to you. If someone asserts that not P, you're going to feel surprised. So it's sort of these inner experiences, phenomenal experiences that are important to having a belief. So then the question becomes, well, can groups have these sorts of phenomenal dispositions? But that brings us right back to the question of whether groups can have internal representations, right? So the old school dispositionalism sort of try to get rid of the internal representations by talking only about behavior, but now we have new school dispositionalism, and the internal representations just come back in because they sort of enter the picture through these phenomenal dispositions. So we need to sort of tackle that question head on, I think. There is, so let me see. What time did we start?
20 minutes ago.
Okay, so there's plenty of time. All right, so then I'm also going to talk about functionalism for a little bit. So you might be sort of reluctant to, you know, embrace this idea of internal representations if your sympathies lie with dispositionalism or functionalism. So you might think, well, you know, maybe we need not go all the way to representationalism, but maybe sort of functionalism can do the job for us. So let's look at that. So I think of functionalism here as preserving the flavor of dispositionalism, but well, not taking the liberal dispositions that Schwitzgebel wants, so the phenomenal dispositions on board, because you might find those objectionable. Okay, so according to functionalism, to believe that P is to, and this is just a rough characterization, I mean, there's books have been written, of course, about this, but this is sort of the flavor of the view. So to believe that P is to be in some particular states that figures in the appropriate causal roles pertaining to P. So those are going to include the forward-looking dispositions that I talked about before, but also sort of backward-looking causal roles. So to believe that P would be here, so to have believed that P, sort of a relevant backward-looking causal role would be that P is sort of, say P is a perceptual belief, then the backward-looking role would be that to be in that state, to believe that P is for P, wait, I'm not, okay, let me backtrack. Okay, so a backward-looking causal role would be for a belief to be typically caused by certain kinds of visual experiences in the appropriate circumstances, and, right? Or for P to be sort of typically caused by reflecting on other propositions that imply P, right? So backward-looking causal roles. Good. And of course, once you have these backward-looking causal roles on board, that gives you sort of a more fine-grained way of individuating beliefs. So that might help you to deal with Chisholm's worry that there's going to be this mutual interdependence. So whether you're going to have a certain disposition is going to depend on other beliefs and desires you have. Well, you might think once we have these backward-looking things on board, that we might be able to deal with that. Okay. So the question then is, well, what about group beliefs, group collective states? Are they going to be amenable to this sort of analysis? Well, it's certainly, so if you think about individual belief, and we form beliefs all the time. It's sort of, it happens automatically to us. So we form beliefs, in broad-ranging ways without consciously attempting to do so. It just happens to us. It seems that that's not going to be the case for groups, especially if you think about group belief along the lines of the joint acceptance account, right? So it requires a real conscious effort on the part of the group. Nonetheless, given the purposes of the group, so what kind of group it is and what its purposes are, it seems there are going to be sort of characteristic backward-looking causal roles that are associated with group beliefs, right? So if, say we're thinking about a committee, the purpose of which is to establish a certain consensus view in a scientific discipline, then given that that's the purpose, it's going to be the case that that group will tend to form beliefs that typically caused by a certain process of deliberation, reflecting on scientific evidence, and that's going to be a kind of backward-looking causal role. Okay, so this might work for groups. Groups might sort of satisfy functionalist conditions on belief. So I think actually, this might be a promising approach to sort of avoid the objection. But there are, again, sort of well-known objections to functionalism, at least at the individual level. So I'm sort of still thinking about to what extent those objections are also going to apply at the level of collective belief. And so this is going to be sort of an open-ended point. When you think about the individual level, there's a worry here that some beliefs are caused in a typical way. So you might think those beliefs don't really satisfy the typical sort of backward-looking causal roles. And of course, there's the swamp man case. It seems that swamp man might have all sorts of beliefs, yet his beliefs wouldn't be caused. They wouldn't stand in the right backward-looking causal roles. Now, it's unclear that that sort of thing would apply to groups. Well, you might think maybe there are swamp groups, right? Just a group, a committee, just emerging out of the swamp, having this belief. I don't know. The swamp man is pretty implausible to begin with. This sounds even more crazy. I don't know. I guess I'm going to think about this more. Anyway, sort of a quick note here, a quick interlude about the dialectical situation. You might think, well, it was unlikely in the first place that functionalists are going to push this kind of objection against group belief, right? Because functionalists, maybe they wouldn't be so, and they wouldn't insist on the necessity of internal representations in any sort of strong, robust sense in the first place. So, maybe this is all fine, but sort of the real challenge comes from representationalism about belief. So, with that in mind, I'm just going to try and find a holy grail and see whether, if you're a representationalist about belief, you can still reply to the objection. Okay, so I noticed that I forgot to include sort of an explicit characterization of representationalism on the handout. So here's what representationalism about belief is. To believe that P is to have some sort of representation in one's mind or head with P as its propositional content, right? So the exact nature of that representation is up for debate, but it must be something inside your head or mind. All right, so in this, finally, this is where the extended mind stuff comes in. So potentially the dumb stuff. Okay, so if there's a case to be made that groups can have representations, so genuinely collective representations, then we can resist the argument by rejecting premise 2. Right? So premise 2 said, if groups don't have an internal mental life of their own, they cannot have internal representations. So I'm going to try to argue that even though groups don't have a mind in any literal sense, they can still have internal representations, collective representations. And I propose to do that by taking a page from the extended mind literature. And here's a modified parity principle. I mean, the parity principle has been on most of the slides that we saw, so I'm not gonna, I figured it would be okay if I don't put it on the handout. But here's my proposed modification for it. So if, as a collective confronts some task, a part of the collective's cognitive life functions as a state or process which, were to be or go on in the head of an individual, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as a mental attitude, then that part of the group's cognitive life is a collective mental attitude. So this is exactly analogous to the original parity principle, but with some modifications. So note that I'm talking about the group's, the collective's cognitive life. I mean, I don't mean to do that in any sort of question-begging way. So by talking about cognitive life, I'm not assuming that there are going to be these internal representations. If you think of the cognitive as sort of, something that doesn't necessarily involve representations, then that's fine. Okay, so it seems to me that, there's also these other conditions. So so that's the modified parity principle. I'm going to use that, and I'm also going to look at the other conditions that have been suggested as necessary conditions for an extended mind. So the 4 things there: consistent availability, ready access, automatic endorsement, and past endorsement, and also the basically the trust and glue stuff that Fred talked about this morning. So test case. Look at the joint acceptance account of group belief. Does it satisfy the parity principle, the modified parity principle? Well, it seems to me that it does. If there's a group that has formed a certain belief, by going through the right procedure, then that group has sort of represented the proposition that P to itself, so its members have considered it. And it seems that once it has done so, and that's sort of the standing view, they're going to act on it, they're going to use it as a premise in their reasoning, practical or theoretical. So and all of that is to say that it just plays the role of an internal representation, were it to go on inside the head of an individual. So I think there's a good case to be made that group beliefs do this. What about the other conditions? Well, again, I think it's very straightforward to see that group beliefs are going to satisfy those as well. So the belief is going to be consistently available in the sense that if the group is there, it's going to remember that this was their belief. And if one individual in the group doesn't remember it, the others are going to explain, well, remember, this was the view we adopted. This was our belief. Ready access, that's going to be okay. Automatic endorsement, also, right? Because this is, it is the group's standing view, so it's going to endorse it. And of course, necessarily there's going to be past endorsement because a group can only take up a belief by explicitly considering it and accepting it. So it must have endorsed that P, the belief that P in the past. So the cognitive integration, trust and glue type stuff also seems okay. So if this group view, once it's been accepted, it's going to figure in the group's life. A group eventually, it might sort of influence the surrounding environment. Sorry, it might influence the individual members in the group. The group might later revise its belief because it acquires new information or needs to make a new decision. So all that stuff is there, it seems to me. Now, you might be worried about what I'm doing here, because it seems that these arguments are all broadly functionalist in nature, in a way, right? So all these arguments, they sort of rely on functionalist intuitions, it seems. So here, I think we need to sort of be careful about different kinds of functionalism. Perhaps there's equivocation going on. So I don't think representationalists need to deny that representations play all sorts of functional roles. They just think that there's more to belief than just playing these functional roles. And they might also think that representations play these functional roles essentially, that it's sort of essentially of the nature of representation to play a certain kind of functional role. Furthermore, if you're a physicalist or sort of sympathetic to some sort of physicalism, presumably, at some level, you're going to have to tell some sort of functionalist story. So you're going to maybe analyze representations ultimately in functional terms, once you're at the neural level. So all of that is going to be true for representationalists. So it's not as if representationalists are going to reject functionalism wholesale at every level. So I don't think that employing these kinds of arguments, so the broadly functionalist kind of arguments, to argue for the existence of group representations is question begging in any way. Okay, so this is my proposal for understanding collective representations. Now note how this is both more radical and less radical, I think, than the extended mind hypothesis. So the more radical part might be this, and this is the bottom of the first column on your handout. So groups don't have a literal mind, but these robustly collective attitudes that I've been talking about are inside the group's metaphorical mind. So I'm countenancing that there are these collective attitudes that aren't really inside a literal mind, but they're still sort of within the group in an important way. So it's also less radical, I think, than the extended mind hypothesis, in that there's no involvement. I mean, there need not be any involvement of external apparatus here. So it's not as if necessarily groups are going to use notebooks or technological devices to record their beliefs. So in that sense, everything that's going on in terms of cognition is still going on inside the heads of individuals. So there's not that kind of extension. Okay, now on to some worries and my replies to those worries. And you'll notice that I'm drawing a lot of these worries from objections or worries about the extended mind hypothesis. So a lot of people have sort of talked about the Otto and Inga cases, and they point out that there are going to be these differences between Otto and Inga in terms of their behavior. If you ask Otto whether he sort of believes that the museum is on 53rd Street, he might say, well, no, I don't really believe it, but I can look it up. Whereas Inga would just say, yes, I believe it. So how does that play out for group beliefs? Well, it seems this is not going to be a problem for group belief. And if you ask the group, by talking to a representative or by talking to the group as a whole, whether it believes that P, the group is just going to say yes. So it's not going to hesitate and think, well, I need to we need to consult first with the other group members. If a group has accepted a certain view as the group's belief, they're just going to affirm it right away. So I don't think these sorts of differences, I don't think you get these sorts of differences with group belief. So different sort of behavioral dynamics, so with sort of internal memory versus the notebook, it seems you can sort of take away the notebook. I mean, sort of a prankster might exchange the notebook for a different one without auto-noticing it. And therefore, it's importantly different than internal memory, because that can't happen with internal memory. What about group belief? Again, I don't think there are any problems here. So it's not the case that people can just sort of take away any device on which the group belief is recorded. It can be sort of quickly exchanged without the group noticing it. So none of that is going to be the case here. Another objection. So what about the sort of fine-grained functional differences? So people have pointed out that individual memory is subject to various effects that Otto in his notebook wouldn't be subject to. So it might be memory distortion going on, different kinds of memory, maybe sort of biases that internal memory is subject to, but the notebook wouldn't be subject to. And therefore, Otto's notebook system is different, is not a real case of memory or belief. So I think there might be a little more to this objection. So you might point out, think about individual belief. That's going to be subject to biases, heuristics, distortion. But group belief, not so much. Or maybe it might be subject to these sorts of things, but in a different way. So when you sort of look at it in a really, really fine-grained way, there are going to be these differences. Okay, so I grant that there are going to be these small functional differences at the fine-grained level between individual belief and group belief. But at the same time, it still seems that these are going to be the same kinds of... So social psychology seems to show that when people sort of reason in groups or form views in groups, it's going to be subject to certain kinds of distortions, polarization. So people tend to form some more radical beliefs, or at least in certain kinds of groups, people tend to form more radical beliefs than what they enter the group with. There is sort of this thing called groupthink, where people sort of engaging in wishful thinking at the group level. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are going to be these effects, but they're going to be sort of the same kinds of effects that you find in individuals. So yes, there are these fine-grained differences, but I don't see why that should lead us to conclude that it's going to be this really different thing, individual belief and group belief, and the group belief really not counting as belief. I don't see why that conclusion would follow from these fine-grained differences. All right, so maybe one of the biggest worries would be, well, what about those phenomenal dispositions, right? Because they were sort of important to the worry of representations. So how do groups even have these phenomenal dispositions? Because that crucially seems to involve internal representations of one sort or another. So do groups have those phenomenal dispositions? Well, maybe not in exactly the same way, but I would argue in pretty much the same ways. So suppose a group has taken up the belief that P, and someone from outside the group asserts that not P. Well, the group is going to be surprised. They're going to wonder, hey, why does that person think not P? Because our belief is that P. Again, if the group sort of considers whether P, and it has taken up the belief that P, the group is, so that's to say that the individuals in the group are going to think, oh yeah, P seems true to us. Yeah. So P has that glow of truth to it. So there's going to be something very much like individual phenomenal dispositions, I think. And of course, since a group doesn't literally have a mind of its own, it's not going to take place inside a mysterious group mind. It's going to take place in the minds of the individuals, but very much similar to individual phenomenal dispositions, I think. So again, I don't think this is a good objection. So as a last resort, you might worry that, well, these collective representations that you're talking about, they just aren't made of the right mental stuff. So whatever that may be. I mean, this sort of gets us back to, well, in a way, to Paul Taggart's, the quote on page 1, where he says, well, beliefs are sort of, they're realized in neural mechanisms. Groups don't have their own neural mechanisms, so therefore there are no collective representations. I guess I just don't find that convincing. So the final objection that robustly collective attitudes aren't made of the right mental stuff or material stuff also doesn't go through. So my conclusion is that both dispositionalists of the old school and new school kind and representationalists can countenance the existence of robustly collective attitudes, and therefore the objection against them fails. Thank you.